I am honored to be joined again today by author and lawyer and an op-ed contributor to the Washington Post and NBC Think and others, very important writer and voice. Please welcome Teri Kanefield. Teri, hi.
Hi.
So we had a very enlightening discussion on Twitter over the weekend because the White House on Friday formally blocked an attempt by Donald to withhold documents from Congress related to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And, media reporting is that this is setting up a legal showdown between the current and former presidents over executive privilege. And I don't know if it's much of a legal showdown, but I was wondering if you could give us your top line thoughts from a just security piece that you published.
Well, top line would be, if Trump picks this battle, that would be very stupid. And actually stupid is a well-recognized legal term. I'm only speaking at the highest levels here. It would be dumb. And so whether he's going to do it, I don't know, but it would really not be a good idea for a lot of reasons, which we can, sort of talk about what the process would be, what the law is, what would happen. But the bottom line is, actually the sort of bottom line is, he would not just lose, but he would trigger a very bad ruling against him, which would be that the documents that he's trying to conceal contain evidence of wrongdoing. And so right out of the gate, he'd get a ruling, which is what he's trying to prevent. So he's better off letting it go. Does that mean he will? And also the other thing I'll say is that, I can walk through like what the process is, what's probably going to happen, but ultimately nobody really can predict a court.
Yeah, and we've covered extensively, like for example, the raid on Cohen, the raid on Rudy, and how the court appointed what's called a special master, in both cases, retired Judge Barbara Jones, to go through the tranche of documents and determine what is or isn't covered by attorney-client privilege in those cases.
Let me just interrupt and say that's probably not going to happen in this case.
Right, and
it would be that's very unlikely because it's a different standard. Mm-hmm. So what's being asked is a different question at the threshold, and so I don't think, and if I'm wrong about this, then then what I guess I'm wrong about it. But I from